Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this special webinar presented by ELMRI Responsible Investments. My name is James McLean. For those of you who haven't met me, I am the Marketing and Business Development Manager here at ELMRI. Now, usually when we run webinars and events, they're focused on us. They're focused on our investments and the markets and issues like that. But occasionally the opportunity comes up to present something a little bit different that we think will be of great interest and great value to our investors and our community. And that's what today is. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We're going to try and keep the webinar to 30 minutes at the most. So keep it nice and brief. There will be about a 15-minute presentation starting in a moment. And if you do have questions, which are great, down to the bottom right of your screen, there should be a questions tab. So please do put in questions in there and we'll have time for them at the end. So we haven't ignored them. We'll get to them towards the end, but please add them in there as we go. So on to the topic for today, which is renewable natural gas, RNG, biogas. Now, how do we get there? What are we thinking about? So obviously, the clean energy transition is currently a topic that is garnering a lot of thought, a lot of work, and a lot of political attention, both here in Australia and overseas. We're seeing governments and companies making net zero pledges and setting emission reduction timelines, and also doing a lot of work planning and developing our renewable energy capacity. But there's also pushback with the suggestion that our clean energy capacity isn't being developed as quickly as we need, and that perhaps renewables aren't reliable enough to underpin society's energy requirements. For instance, here in Victoria, we have a looming deadline coming up very quickly, which is about our usage of natural gas and the reduction in gas extracted from the Bass Strait, which is currently happening, meaning that in 2027, we're projected to hit a cliff where we will be using more gas as a state than we produce. So while most of the public attention is focused on wind farms, solar cells, and currently here in Australia, a rather strange, I think, political debate about nuclear energy, there are other solutions out there that aren't gaining the media spotlight. And one of these solutions is biogas, renewable natural gas, RNG. And that's what we're here to learn about today. So I'd like at this point to introduce our special guest presenter, who is Dr. Scott Grierson. Now, Dr. Grierson is one of Australia's leading bioenergy experts. He has a PhD in environmental science from Macquarie. He's been an advisory panel member for ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. And currently his role is as the CEO and managing director of Valorify, a bioenergy project development company who are currently working on multiple RNG projects around Australia. So Scott, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to hand it over to you to give the presentation. So thanks again.
Thank you, James, for the kind introduction, and good morning, everybody. So yeah, Scott Grierson is my name, and as James in his introduction shared with you, I work for a business called Valorify, and for what it's worth, the name Valorify is a bit of a play on that terminology in chemistry of valorization and to valorize something. So for us, Valorify, a bit like a Shopify, is a made-up verb, which is all about enhancing and adding value to things. So turning kind of essentially, in our context, low-value materials into high-value products. So today I'm going to talk to you about what I believe is part of the clean energy transition solutions that Australia really seriously needs to be considering. And you'll see as we go through that this is a very well-established, very large and rapidly expanding sector in many other countries around the world, including many of our OECD peers. And for some reason, it is missing in the Australian context in any big way. So we're trying to change that. And thank you for your time and attention today. So firstly, I wanted to take a step back for those of you that may not be familiar with biogas and what we mean when we refer to that. So biogas is a mixture, essentially, predominantly of what we call biomethane. So it's a methane molecule, CH4, exactly the same as what you get in natural gas, but it comes from a biological origin. So biogas is a mixture of that biomethane molecule with carbon dioxide, biogenic carbon dioxide that's formed through the the natural breakdown, the anaerobic digestion of organic matter through a bacterial process in an oxygen-free environment. You can see in that diagram on the left, there's a range of different types of feedstocks that can go into an anaerobic digester to produce biogas. That includes livestock manure, it includes crops and crop residues in our case. It can be wastewater, and many of you will be familiar with wastewater treatment plants that have biogas production even in Australia today, and things like food waste, FOGO, these sorts of things that can go in as well. Now, all of that gets broken down by these organisms and converted into that biogas product. And then there's a number of downstream uses and markets that can then be directed into. You can generate electricity and heat directly from that mixed biogas product without needing to do any separation, or you can actually then separate and upgrade that biogas to take out and isolate the methane molecule from the CO2, and then use that methane directly into injection into the gas grid, or even as a liquid fuel for transport. And equally, the thing that this diagram doesn't also tell you is what's the fate of the biogenic carbon dioxide. Of course, when that's separated, you can also sell that into industrial markets. There is one other byproduct from this process. It's what we call digestate, which is the residual mineral and nutrient matter and a bit of residual carbon in that breakdown process that can then be converted into a fertilizer or soil amendment product and returned back to the land. So typically, the percentage of methane, of course, changes depending on reaction kinetics and reactor designs, the feedstock mix and the heterogeneity or homogeneity of that mix. Excuse me, but it typically ranges between 45% and as much as 75% of biomethane in that mixed biogas fraction. And as I say, it can be used as it is, or it can be upgraded and separated. That biomethane, which, by the way, in James's introduction, he used the term renewable natural gas, or RNG, and that's typically how it's referred to in many other parts of the world. We tend to use the term biomethane in Australia, but it's biologically derived, so it's very different to that fossil gas in origin, because the base carbon molecules that are part of that biogas or biomethane fraction are biogenic in origin. They're simply cycling through the biosphere on a regular basis. So that's the quick introduction and background on biogas. The International Energy Agency is pretty big on biomethane, and recently came out in their World Energy Outlook under the net zero emissions scenario in October 2023, identifying a role for biogas in contributing to the decarbonisation of the global economy. And I'll let you read that quote, but really they really are pushing on the natural attributes of a biogas plant, which is for versatility and flexibility within the energy system, as it says. And we think we tend to agree. And the outlook moving forward to 2050 is for 400 billion cubic meters of biomethane equivalent. So 15,500 petajoules in our language here in Australia, which is a significant volume. That's roughly, it's probably about 12 times of Australia's current total natural gas consumption on a domestic scale. So there we go. Australia's gas market dynamics, we're talking 1,200 petajoules roughly on an annual basis, but that's eclipsed somewhat by our LNG exports. I think at the moment we occupy position number 2 on the global market for exports, but there is this East Coast gas shortfall that is predicted, and particularly in Victoria. So there's a big gas supply crunch. Equally, at the same time, we've got policies that are actually looking to reduce natural gas consumption by 50% in the state of Victoria, for instance, by 2035, and a lot of push on domestic household electrification to remove those gas connections, and some of you will be familiar with that. But the point I wanted to make actually is that commercial industrial customers rely on gas for as much as 70% of their primary energy needs, and that's both for thermal and even also, actually, I beg your pardon, not just for energy needs, but also material feedstock needs. And a lot of the thermal demand, in particular in these industrial processes, is north of 150 degrees. So it's not really suitable for electrification at the present time. And certainly hydrogen is neither cost competitive or in volume in the market at the moment either. So there's a big gap, particularly for those hard to abate commercial industrial customers. Just to put it into perspective, internationally, so in Europe, in the European Union, in 2022, they produced 18 billion cubic meters of biogas. So that's equivalent to about 700 petajoules. and that's ramping up to close to 10 times that by 2050 based on current targets. Asia, there's significant growth, and I'll talk about, it's a bit hard to ignore China in any of these sort of conversations. They famously have 100,000 commercial scale biogas plants distributed across the country, and I actually saw a figure of 39 million, just over 39 million estimated household scale biogas plants that are used to produce cooking gas at a very, very small scale. But just the scale is always staggering in China. Germany, famously, though, is a big leader in the European Union, about 10,000 biogas plants, many of which were sort of farm scale and smaller, but they're now giving way to much larger and more efficient sort of utility scale installations. I won't say any more about this slide. The only story that I wanted to tell here is one that relates to the nation of Denmark. And Denmark on track at this stage to be 100% self-sufficient as a nation for biomethane supply to supplant essentially Russian natural gas, probably around 2030, 2032 is the current trajectory at the moment. So really quite phenomenal in terms of what can be achieved in terms of the scale. So the IEA sees it as a big player in the future. Biogas is a mature technology. It's been around for decades. As I said before, the usage can be either direct use of the biogas or upgrading and separating it to the biomethane. But under the net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, production of biogases need to quadruple by 2030 in order for us to actually be on track to meet those targets. So growth of 32% over the next 5 years, or in the current sort of 5-year period, is forecast. So massive growth overseas. And interestingly, by 2040, the biggest contribution to biogas production is going to come from ag residues. So, and that's exactly the space that we're aiming to play in here in Australia. So the basic concept we're running with is this idea that cereal straw is available in large volume in the Australian agricultural context. In its raw form, when you take it off the paddock, it's quite hydrophobic and it's structurally quite rigid. It's a tough material. So straight off the paddock, it's not particularly great for making biogas. But one of its inherent advantages is it's dry. So it's coming off the paddock, it's sub 15% moisture. So it's very concentrated in terms of energy content and what we call volatile solids, which is important for the production of biogas. So we can pre-treat the material essentially and disrupt the microporous structure of the straw. And suddenly this indigestible material becomes eminently digestible. And that's really exciting because it raises what we call the BMP, the biomethane potential of the feedstock, from that sort of pretty low level, very ordinary range to something that's quite compelling, up around 400 to 450 litres of methane. So per kilogram of volatile solids. So that's really quite compelling. And the good news is, as I say, there's shed loads of it, so to speak. And this is identified by the Future Fuels CRC here in Australia as the largest source of biomass feedstock in the country. One other point to make is there is a direct relationship between grain yields in the cereal cropping sector and the amount of stubble that you get, and it varies slightly from crop to crop. Wheat, you get about 1.5 tonnes on average per tonne of grain. Canola, 3 to 1. Barley, 3.2 to 1. But when we looked at the available, because the central question that you're always trying to ask as a biogas developer, and it's always of interest to investors, is how much material is out there? How much security do you have over this feedstock supply? Excuse me. And when we looked at the publicly available data in relation to this, we weren't entirely convinced that it was accurate, and we wanted to have a different kind of data point and way of understanding what was available in the market, because our belief is that there's quite a few shortcomings with the traditional desktop estimates that are out there in the public domain. So we thought we'd take a different approach. So what we did is we partnered with an Israeli-Australian startup, actually, that had links with Monash University, that uses high-resolution satellite images from NASA to actually predict the amount of standing stubble in the paddock. And to cut a long story short, in a 150-kilometre radius of one of our project sites in Ararat in Western Victoria, there's an estimated 3.5 to as much as 4.7 million tonnes of standing stubble on the ground. This was in the 2022-23 harvest season at the beginning of last year. And that's a pretty phenomenal amount of stubble standing there, and that's for wheat only. So in that catchment, you're looking at barley, canola, oats are pretty big as well. When you look at that over a time series to look at the impact of drought and climate and weather variation, etc., you can even see that in 2019, which is a drought year, this is in the Western Riverina in southern New South Wales, for wheat only, there was 1.4 million tonnes of stubble available in that particular catchment. Now, to put it into context, one of the plants that we're looking to establish, each single plant only requires 300,000 tonnes per annum. So in the Ararat catchment, where there was probably in the order of 6 to 7 million tonnes when you include the other crop stubbles, then we're talking a very, very small fraction of the available material. I'm conscious of time, so I'll move a bit faster. But in terms of supply chain innovation, what we're introducing with this particular lignocellulosic straw technology and anaerobic digestion of that is some inherent advantages, we think, over the traditional conventional wet putrescible pathway to produce biogas and that anaerobic digestion plants typically operate on, so using food waste or manure. So those sorts of plants we see are constrained by transport costs, because you're really moving a lot of water around. Essentially, you're moving 80% or more water content in those feedstocks. So unless you're a wastewater treatment plant where the mountain comes to Muhammad, so to speak, through a sewage pipe, it's pretty expensive to move things around. So these plants typically need gate fees to work, so you need to get paid to take those sort of wastes. But we see a lot of competition for those sorts of feedstocks, so there's a bit of downward pressure. And so if you're building a business case on those gate fees, then you might find that there's a bit of downward pressure on those gate fees over time. Because they're mostly water, they don't produce a lot of biogas, so you might get gate fees up front and generate a lot of revenue, but at the back end of the plant, you're not producing a lot of biogas per tonne of material handled. They're very heterogeneous, those sort of materials, so it's a bit of a mixed bag essentially. And of course, if you're talking manure, for instance, in Australia, it's quite limited in volume. You know, we're a broader acre ranching type animal livestock business or nation here. We don't do an enormous amount of kind of barn reared animals or a huge amount of feedlot type approaches that you have in the United States and in lots of parts of Europe as well, where animals are even housed in barns for 6 months or more of the year. So I mentioned before that straw is typically cut at sub 15% inherent moisture, so it is dry and very high in calorific value. We can then densify and stockpile that to optimize for a year-round operation, and really by transforming the material in this way, what we're getting is about a 20 times uplift in the amount of volatile solids per tonne of feedstock that's being moved around and handled. So you get that great sort of concertina effect or concentration of value. And then through this process that we're working with, the Danish technology versus a conventional manure-based plant, we're getting about a 70% uplift also in biogas production per tonne of volatile solids. So all in all, you're converting almost as much as 90% of the primary energy of the straw into a biomethane product, which is a pretty phenomenal efficiency. The final point to make here is that scale is really important, and we see lots of commercial industrial customers, as I mentioned before, that are looking for 500,000 gigajoules per annum plus. And so we really need to go big also in order to move the dial and service these sorts of customers. So very simple illustration, in Tonda in Denmark, there's a 930,000 tonne a year biogas plant that uses a more traditional pathway of manure, energy crops and mixed organics. That produces about 1.5 petajoules per annum of separated biomethane per annum. In Vordenborg in Denmark, there's a plant under late stage development at the moment, which is calibrated for 500,000 tonnes of straw input. And it's a higher temperature process, what we call a thermophilic process, that will produce 7 petajoules of biomethane, separated per annum. So what you're getting really, in simple terms, is roughly the 50% of the feedstock throughput of that traditional wet putrescible plant that's giving you almost 5 times the biogas yield. That's how this shakes out in terms of the innovation that we're offering. A couple of final points to make, because I'm conscious of time. Somewhere between 26 and as much as 61% of straw is burnt in the paddock in Australia. So a lot of this resource is simply going up into the atmosphere. In the WA wheat belt in 2022, there was a crop stubble permit, a burn-off permit issued on a 43-degree day that turned into a scrub fire that burned 450 square kilometres of infrastructure and crops and livestock and livelihoods. In the European Union, a lot of states have long since banned burn-off, and now the Victorian EPA, for instance, has said that they want to reduce the impact of agricultural burn-off. It's one of their strategic priorities right now. So the writing is on the wall for this practice. It also costs farmers to burn, so that there are increasing costs of compliance and permitting and having to manage that burn in an effective way to minimise its risk. So it's actually a net cost for a lot of farmers. And so ultimately it's got a lot of negative social, commercial, environment and human health impacts. So we think it needs to stop. I won't say any more on that, but essentially, there is this opportunity to utilise this vast resource, a large majority of which is often just simply being devolatilized to the atmosphere. So we're reading a lot about in the paper that there's a challenge in getting renewable energy projects out the door. Now, typically when the government and in mainstream dialogue, people are talking about renewable energy, they're really talking about renewable electricity. There is this missing piece of renewable heat and renewable gas. But one of the biggest barriers at the moment is access to high voltage transmission infrastructure that allows wind and solar plants to connect. And obviously we're all for those and we hope that they continue, but there are all these bottlenecks occurring. So one of the points I wanted to make and leave you with is that it costs really a very small fraction to transport and store renewable energy as gas in a pipeline when you compare it with batteries or pump storage hydro as a form of storage. And Australia has 39,000 kilometres of these pipelines in place. They're already in the ground. This is equivalent to a roughly 50 Snowy 2.0 hydro schemes. Now, the current price of the Snowy 2.0, the very first one, is at 12 billion at the moment. It was at 3 about 3 or 4 years ago. So who knows what the price tag will be by the time it's finished. But my point is it's a very, very cheap and strategic opportunity to use the infrastructure we already have. So that's a final thought I'll leave you with. We are out raising as a business at the moment to bring the first 3-4 petajoule scale plants to the market in Australia. So to put that into context, 4 petajoules is roughly equivalent for one project to about 6.5% of the Victoria's commercial industrial gas demand today. By 2035, it'll be closer to sort of 10-12% based on low temperature heat reduction from heat pumps, etc. So we think there's a really good strategic opportunity here, and we're looking for investors that are willing to jump on board and actually bring scalable biogas to the Australian market for the first time. So I might leave it there, but actually there is one final thought I will leave you with, James, and everybody else. These are some recent biogas sector transactions. So Archaea Energy were acquired by BP in the United States recently for $4.1 billion US. Shell bought a company in Denmark called Nature Energy, a developer that in the biogas sector. They had 13 plants established at the time, equivalent to roughly 7.6 petajoules. So that was sold for US $2 billion, that portfolio of projects. So we're proposing with our 3-4 petajoule plants to produce 12 petajoules per annum. So that puts a bit of a marker on what the value in the market of this kind of infrastructure looks like. I might leave it there. Thanks, James.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott, for such an interesting and informative presentation. Just a reminder to our viewers, there is a question tab. So please, any questions, we've got some time for questions now. So please feel free to type them in now. One that has come through. What do you think the blockage is here in Australia for RNG? Europe and China are moving ahead. Why not here?
Well, yeah, we haven't got a lot of time. That's probably a red wine discussion, but
sure.
I think you'd have to say that Australia being blessed, as it were, I suppose, with natural resources, we've got a lot of traditional fossil gas, and everybody is aware of that. We've been very focused on that for a long time. So certainly a surfeit of kind of natural gas is one of the factors. I think it's also the case that the regulatory environment and policy environment has not been particularly supportive of bioenergy more generally in Australia compared to many other jurisdictions. We don't also have, the low carbon fuel standard or these sorts of incentives that are present in other parts of the world, like the United States, for instance. And I think it's largely also that we don't often connect different parts of the economy in a strategic sense. I mean, the beauty of a biogas pathway is that it's actually marrying waste management and the more effective management of waste with an energy market. And often we don't have that cross-fertilization of policy and portfolios that enable these things to be more strategically addressed.
Do you see any changes in that area as where
there's definitely a lot of movement at the station, as they say, and there are now there's a lot of work being done to revise, for instance, the Australian gas pipeline standard for the injection of biomethane. There's now what we call a guarantee of origin certificate that will be launched by the federal government the middle of 2024. There's already a green power scheme supported by the New South Wales government to allow for the injection of biomethane into natural gas networks. And there's a growing interest in the sector from investors across the board that are seeing that diversity in the economy is important, and it's a fast route to decarbonisation of many of those, as I say, hard to abate in commercial industrial customers in particular.
Yeah, just actually on that, I had a bit of a question, like on those hard to abate industrial customers. If we don't start producing biomethane, can they change? Will they change, do you think, or will they just be stuck having to buy gas from outside the state, say here in Victoria, outside of Victoria at much increased rates?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of, we've got this absurd situation in Australia of being the second biggest exporter of LNG, and here we are contemplating a shortfall of gas in the Australian domestic market. Like, you couldn't create a more absurd situation if you tried. Yeah, look, it's, I think the customers that aren't able to kind of access an alternative are really just going to have to pay the penalty. If you're a safeguard, covered under the safeguard mechanism, for instance, if you haven't achieved the decarbonisation targets in due course, you're going to start to be hit with penalties. A lot of them, I think, typically people underestimate the amount of embodied sort of capital and infrastructure, as well as even skill sets that these industrial organisations have in terms of being chained to the gas train, so to speak. And so what we're trying to do and what we can offer is a complete fuel switch that achieves those decarbonisation targets, but doesn't require them to retool, reskill, change anything, actually. It's a simple procurement exercise, really, to sign an offtake agreement, just like they do to procure renewable electricity today under a corporate PPA. So,
and one last question. Obviously, kind of said at the start, there's a lot of different technologies that we're talking about as part of the clean energy transition. How do you see RNG and biomethane fitting into that? Do you think, is it a transition technology or a long-term technology underpinning, say, solar, wind, these other things?
The way I think of it, James, is that we will always produce waste, particularly biological waste from farms, from factories, from society more generally. We're getting better at utilising it, and I think this is one of those routes and one of those opportunities is to continue to better utilise it. So for me, I don't see this as a transition. If you look at the state of California, 65% of the buses that run in the state of California run on bio-LNG, which is derived from biomethane that's liquefied and used to run trucks. I used to live in southern Sweden, and southern Sweden, all of the buses run on bio CNG that comes from biogas plants. So I think it's a solution that is part of the equation. And I think if we're thinking about the clean energy transition, we have to think about diversity. Different types of energy and different forms of energy suit different types of applications in the economy. There is no one size fits all. You cannot simply electrify everything. We can't afford it. And nor does it actually deal with that residual waste problem that we have. So it's really about, do you want to continue torching, for instance, ag waste in the paddock and sending that CO2 to atmosphere when it could be displacing fossil resources that make up part of the energy system? I think it's both an important solution for the transition, but I think has a long-term prospect and will be very cost competitive in the short to medium term. Great.
One last question has come through, and then we'll wrap up. So we at Elm, we're invested in Novozymes as part of the Global Fund, which they supply inputs that can be used in this industry, in the production of biomethane. Can you get access to similar inputs here in Australia for this industry and the supply chain to grow here domestically, or is it coming from international sources?
If I understand the question, certainly I'm aware that Novozymes, among many of the products and services that they offer to the global bioenergy sector in particular, are producing some enhancements, I suppose, and additives that can be used in anaerobic digestion. So we're certainly excited, and we're already exploring that incidentally at the moment in conversation with Novozymes, whether how we would source that input, whether it comes or can be produced in the domestic market, or whether it has to be imported from overseas. I'm not too sure at this stage, but certainly we see, we're looking at all of those different kind of additives and ways to improve the efficiency of the biological process. And Novozymes are certainly very, very well credentialed and well positioned to assist us with that.
All right. Well, we've just hit half an hour. We might start to wrap up there. Thank you, Scott, so much for your time and your expertise. It's been really fascinating. Now, if any of our viewers want to get in touch with you to learn more about biomethane, about Valorify, about your projects, how can they do that?
They can do that by contacting me here on this email address, or by all means, anybody, please give me a call on my mobile, and very happy to take your call, and excited to carry that conversation.
Yep, and of course, we're also happy to facilitate an introduction at Elm. So my email is just james@elmri.com, elmri.com. So either which way, it would be great to make connections. So we might wrap up there. Any final thoughts, Scott, or just thanks again?
Excuse me, I've got the cough, so I won't carry on. But thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right, great. Well, thank you to everyone for tuning in, and have a great weekend. Thanks again.
Thanks all.